All right, everybody, welcome back. Episode number 36 of Words. We had our first, no, it was our second guest. Our first guest had been David Martin, I think, right?
Yeah, yes, David was our first.
So, but
hard act to follow. Hard act to follow.
You're doing a bang-up job. Bang-up job.
Bang-up job. So episode number 36 was with Robert Forte, who we had a conversation with that we decided would lead to other conversations. So we are today opening up a Words sort of pocket universe. And so all of the episodes that we do with Robert on the various characters of the psychedelic intelligence, metaphysical, spiritual realm, world, what layer, whatever, will be number 36, but they will be numbered 36. This will be episode 36.1. This is going to be about Gordon Wasson, and going forward, it'll be 36.2, 3, 4, whatever it is. And that's how we will keep track of the episodes that are with Robert. So,
I love this system that you've created, Emily. You're a goddamn genius.
I'm glad at least you think so. Anywho, so Robert is with us today, and we are going to dig into the person, character, mirage, composite, I don't know exactly, myth that is Gordon Wasson. So Robert, welcome back, and I'm looking forward to delving into this mysterious being with you. How are you?
Okay, thank you. Really good to be here and to sort through this.
Robert, can I interject really quickly?
Yes.
Are we pronouncing your last name correctly?
No, you're not actually. There are three correct pronunciations of my name. For the last 10 or 20 years, I've been using Forte, the more correct Italian pronunciation.
Okay.
So, but Forte is also correct, and 40 is what I used to use. But when I went to Italy a little while ago, they said Forte, and it just sounded right. So
that would have been my first guess at how to pronounce it, but Dani said Forte, and since she knew you, I was like, okay, that must be what it is. So we can, just to be as confusing as everything else in this world, maybe we'll just say it differently every time, right? And if anybody else has any other way they'd like to hear us say it, right, then just submit that in the comment section below.
With the phonetic spelling.
Yeah, we'll experiment with that too.
Forte, and then you got to do this with your fingers too.
Robert Forte.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
All right. So we're going to do this from from three perspectives here. We're going to start with Robert, who actually knew, or at least thought he knew, or thinks he knows, or whatever, right? Gordon Wasson. And from, I have, over the years, I haven't done a deep dive into him, but he's come up over and over in in things I've listened to, some research I've done, and I did peel back a layer since I knew we were doing this show. And then Dani doesn't know too much about Gordon Wasson at all, but she's a journalist and likes to ask questions. So it's kind of coming at it from three different angles here, but we're going to start with Robert because he knew Gordon. And so, why don't you just, if you were going to tell someone about Gordon Wasson, right, whatever you want to say about him, let's just start with that.
Okay. First, I want to just say this little piece that, I've been starting to speak more about my point of view about psychedelic drugs, the first wave in the 50s and 60s, and now this psychedelic renaissance. And I have a very wide range of reactions to what I've been saying, ranging from this is some of the most important information that I've ever heard about psychedelics to you are just paranoid, dark conspiracy theorist. And one of the biggest differences between these two populations concerns their knowledge of American history. That we have a whole generation, maybe two generations of people in our country who have been completely misled as to modern history. Mm-hmm. And so to really get what I'm saying requires some prerequisites, some knowledge of particularly the post-war period. And this, you'll see as we get into this, is very relevant when it comes to Gordon Wasson. Okay, so Gordon Wasson is one of the major figures in the modern psychedelic movement, we'll call it. And even though I use that word psychedelic movement, really there are psychedelic movements. There's one family of drugs but there are several very, very different groups of people that use them with very opposite intentions, okay? But this thing that we call the psychedelic movement really started in the, let's say, the 1930s or early 40s, when Albert Hofmann discovered LSD, reportedly discovered LSD in two stages. Once was the molecule in 1938, and then 5 years later when he discovered its effects. We're going to do another show on Albert Hofmann. I'm just telling you what the kind of official narrative is, that Albert Hofmann discovers LSD in 1943. Aldous Huxley writes The Doors of Perception in 1953, I think that comes out. Gordon Wasson discovers the magic mushroom in a couple of stages and publishes a very sensational article in Life magazine that gets published in 1957. And then Kesey and Leary get into their stuff in the early 1960s. These four events, roughly 5 events, are what brought psychedelic drugs into the mainstream consciousness in America. And we've been kind of led to believe that they were disparate events, that this was an organic unfolding of a phenomena in the United States and in Europe. And I've dove into this subject more than anybody I know in all aspects. And over the last, 10 or 20 years, through a series of events, which we'll describe, I've come to understand that there's a whole nother layer to the story, that this was not an organic unfolding of biochemical, anthropological research, political activity, but these were actually coordinated operations of what we call the deep state, or it was a social engineering operation by agencies like the CIA, started even before the CIA, and that it's an op. It's an op that didn't work perfectly well. There were some backfires in the operation, some things that the engineers did not expect. But it is being reemployed now over the last, whatever we say, 10 or 15 years, that this psychedelic renaissance, you hear that meme a lot, has been deployed. Okay, so Gordon Wasson, the official story that you see repeated again and again, and you see repeated with the most clarity and conviction.
Real quick, I just want to say that the reason we are starting with Gordon Wasson is because that's where your real step into this world started. So even though there was some people and things that occurred before Gordon Wasson that we may go back and investigate, we're starting with Gordon Wasson because he was really your introduction to this whole space. So I just wanted to clarify that for the listeners. Okay, carry on. I'm sorry.
Okay, now I just want to confuse your clarification, because there was actually a very dramatic moment that I shared with Albert Hofmann, who was a good friend of mine, who treated me like his grandson for many years, since 1983 when I first met him. There was an incident in the basement of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in the archive room with Albert, and I believe that was 1988. That was kind of earth-shaking, that began to change my mind about the official story and the agents and operators behind this, behind the drugs. I could say what that was right now, or we can cover that when we get to Albert.
We'll cover that with Albert. So let's just yeah.
Okay, so Gordon Wasson, according to the official story, which, as I started to say, is most clearly and powerfully put forth, I think, in the Michael Pollan book. This book, this runaway bestseller a few years ago, like reintroducing psychedelics to the modern readership. Very, very popular and successful author, felt that he was just moved to investigate psychedelics and wrote kind of the definitive book on it. It's not the definitive book. It's actually the advancement of the operation. We'll get into that later. But Gordon Wasson, Many of us first learned that these psychedelic mushrooms were introduced into the modern world sort of by this, it was a human interest story. Gordon Wasson was a banker. He was a vice president of JP Morgan. He was a top executive in one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country, in the world. And it was his hobby to, he developed this hobby when he's on his honeymoon. It's a very romantic and charming story, a legend. Gordon is on his honeymoon. He and his wife are walking through a meadow in the Catskill Mountains in New York. They come upon a flush of mushrooms growing on the ground. Valentina, his wife from Russia, sees these mushrooms and is very, very excited. Oh, Gordon, look, there. She calls them some endearing Russian name, the little ones. Oh, and she runs over and she goes to collect them all, and she's gonna put them in the stew for their first meal as a married couple. And Gordon, who's Anglo-Saxon, has the opposite reaction. He sees these mushrooms and he is appalled. He is disgusted. He thinks that if she even goes near them, she's gonna get sick. If she touches them, they'll die. Don't know, they have their first fight about these mushrooms. She's looking at him like, she's a pediatrician. He's just getting started in journalism. They're both very competent and intelligent people, and they have a fight about this. She looks at him, oh, Gordon, you're being silly. He's terrified. He refuses to eat the meal. He's convinced he's gonna wake up the next morning and she's gonna be dead. Well, when they wake up the next morning and she's not dead, they're both really struck by this thing that happened between them. And why do they have such completely opposite and very powerful attitudes towards mushrooms? And so they begin their hobby, and they decide to study mushrooms and cultural attitudes towards mushrooms. And they say that they each had a hunch on this first day that religion was behind it. That whenever there's such a deep-seated cultural taboo or affection for something, there's something in the early dawn of religion in those societies must have given rise to this. So they throw themselves into this inquiry, and they devote every minute of their spare time into studying mushrooms. This starts in 1927. So for 20 or so years, they do this, and they become world authorities on mushrooms. They write, their first book is called Mushrooms, Russia and History, which at the time was the most expensive book ever produced and sold. Gordon had a way of, he was a very, kind of aristocratic fellow and very proper, very, very thorough, prodigious scholar and writer. And they produced this book, Mushrooms, Russia and History. Toward the end of this investigation, they learned that there was, in fact, this religious use of mushrooms. And in fact, there was a place in Mexico where they still practiced this worship of a mushroom. And so in the mid-1950s, they raised some money, and they traveled down to this village in Oaxaca, southern Mexico, and they discover this Mazatec community, which centers around a curandera named Maria Sabina, who uses these mushrooms in a kind of mystical, religious, curative way. And Gordon Wasson and his wife become the first white people, the first outsiders to take this mushroom in who knows how long. So they do this, and then a couple years later, they publish this sensational article in Life magazine called Seeking the Magic Mushroom. I believe the date of that is May 1957. So that single event took the mushrooms, which had been known up to that point only by a handful of anthropologists and specialists in Mesoamerican cultures, took this thing from relative obscurity to literally front page news in one of the most popular magazines in America, in the world, Life magazine. So that single thing, a lot of people, as I said, point to that as one of the major events that gave us psychedelic drugs. Wasson then went on from 1957 to publish a series of books. He had a revelation on this evening that these mushrooms were basically the secret origin of religion generally, and then very specifically the religion and philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries, on all Mesoamerican practices, the Indian religions, the Soma of the Rig Veda, and then even the Old Testament, the forbidden fruit. Now again, Wasson was a real snooty guy, and when he published his books, now I happen to, when my house burned down, I had his library, his collection, but I only saved this one. And this is an example of Wasson's books. This was given to me by him. This one's called The Wondrous Mushroom. You can see, really fancy gold leaf. Can you see this on here? These books sold for hundreds of dollars before they came out in popular editions. And Wasson was aiming his research for his class of people. By this time, he had risen in prominence in JP Morgan. He was the vice president of the bank. And this is the official story, a kind of curiosity that this Wall Street banker would kick off this movement of psychedelic drugs in America that became, associated with the counterculture. And
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
And I mean, I have a feeling from the way you're setting it up that the story is bullshit, but how does someone go from journalist to high-level executive at JP Morgan?
Well, okay, we're going to have to look at that a little bit because let me just go on here. My discoveries led me to realize that, first of all, when we say Gordon Wasson was a banker, that's true in a sense that he worked for JP Morgan, and that's sort of a bank. But JP Morgan is much more than a bank. JP Morgan is a very powerful global political force, and a fascist political force. We have to underline that. And this is, again, American history. Like, very few people, unfortunately, are unaware of the role JP Morgan has had in American history. For example, the attempted coup d'etat, the attempted military removal of FDR in 1934, that was spearheaded by JP Morgan and Walker, one of the grandfathers of the Bush family. Very, very powerful industrialists, wanted to remove FDR. They recruited one of the leading brigadier generals of the time, a fellow named Smedley Butler, and they were going to have a military coup. And right as Hitler was installed in Germany, they were going to create a military dictatorship in the United States. Like, were you guys aware of that? Probably.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the whole Smedley Butler issue. I'm familiar with his whistle.
Okay, so so that's just a little bit about Morgan. That's the kind of guy he was. Now, Wasson wasn't a banker in terms of a guy you think that deals with money. Gordon Wasson was into public relations for JP Morgan. He was a propagandist for JP Morgan. Many people that study American history know the name of Edward Bernays.
Edward Bernays. Yeah.
Edward Bernays. So Wasson was kind of working with Bernays and, learning how to manipulate public opinion to advance a economic and political agenda. That's the kind of work he did. So let that be part of an answer to your question, Dani.
I think one way to maybe look at this is a lot of people confuse, like when they think about bankers, they think about money, whereas like really high level bankers and certainly people with an esoteric understanding of banking really think more of currency, right? And so like money is one expression of that. but there's other kinds of currency. There's cultural currency. There's a variety of different ways. And Gordon Wasson was probably like a banker when you think of it more in terms of like currency that can be, spread out across a variety of different cultures, societies, different kinds of things, as opposed to just like what you exchange in order to buy goods at a store or whatever, right? And so when you're talking, we're going to note this because we'll maybe come back to this with a dive into this person who I don't know if you know him or not, but he's a fascinating character, and he actually died at the very beginning of the COVID lockdown. And his name is Kalindi Iyi. Do you know who Kalindi Iyi is?
No, I don't.
Okay, so Kalindi
Iyi,
I'm just going to leave this here. This is the pin. He is an interesting gentleman who is known for taking massive doses of mushrooms, 30 grams or more at a time, right? And sort of explaining the various levels of reality that you move through with a dose like this. And he referred in one of his, so he's done a number of interviews with my friend Sonia Barrett, and I think the second to last interview he ever did with her, he referred to mushrooms as a psychedelic currency. So it doesn't surprise me if you have a person like Wasson, who's a banker, but he's dealing with like quote unquote currencies as opposed to money, and mushrooms may have been one of the things that fell under the idea of currency, something that can move information across boundaries and barriers. And that was the sense that he referred to mushrooms as a psychedelic or a cross-dimensional currency. So
that's extremely interesting to me, and you'll email me, or I'm not remembering the name, but I want to look into that a little bit later. Okay, so that's great. So where are we here?
So Dani had asked you about him as a banker, right? And you were
that's
the story, like the legend of Gordon Wasson.
Yeah, that's the legend, and that was my first kind of awakening to the significance of psychedelic drugs in culture. For me, was learning about Gordon Wasson. I was a third-year student in deciding to learn about religion. I was a student at Columbia University in New York, looking into the history of Indian religions. I'd become very interested in meditation, and I wanted to know who, came up with meditation. How did primitive people discover these techniques that were so simple and powerful and had changed my life? And so I took this course, and in the first day of the course, a professor pointed out that the oldest body of writings in the history of Indian religion are the Vedas, and the oldest of the Vedas is called the Rig Veda, and the Rig Veda is almost exclusively about this ancient ceremony of collecting and preparing and drinking a plant beverage god called soma. Now, historians and Indologists for years have wondered, like, what was soma? And there's a very wide range of opinions about this, from soma was just an imaginary thing, a symbol, a metaphor, to a series of suggestions of botanical sources for soma. And this was in this first lecture, and then professor said, but the theory that is most widely accepted these days is that soma was a psychedelic, a hallucinogenic mushroom, he said, that a banker named Gordon Wasson had introduced in this important book, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. I mean, I'd seen kids using mushrooms and acid and stuff when I was a kid growing up, and I just thought they were weird, and I was kind of, averse to them. But here was this mention of something deeply significant about them historically. And so I just decided I'm going to learn everything about this. And I went down to the bookstore, to Strand's bookstore on Broadway, and bought a few books and just started reading everything. So Wasson not only kicked it off for the culture, for the world, but also for me. And so he was kind of a hero to me. And very quickly, I began to learn more of the common narrative that these psychedelic drugs had since the 40s and 50s had enjoyed a great reputation. Psychiatrists were using them to understand the brain. Psychologists and psychoanalysts were using them to understand the phenomenology of mystical and psychotic experience. And more educated, cultured types like Aldous Huxley were using them with great merit to understand the creative process. And then these characters, Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey, got into it and kind of sensationalized the whole thing and popularized them and turned on kids and started this political movement, which became kind of hysterical and reactionary. And so this really important body of research that Wasson and Hoffman and Groff and others had initiated kind of got lost in the glare of all this hysteria. And so I began, just after a couple of years of being in this, thinking, okay, well, I'm going to help resurrect this subject. And I'm going to help people to, like just put aside all that sensational stuff of Leary, etc., and go back to what these drugs might really teach us about the history of religion, our own consciousness, our own creativity, and healing strategies. So Wasson was my hero, and I went about this. Then I had other important teachers, and then one. Let's see, this was now the winter of 1984. And I took a leave of absence from my graduate school at the University of Chicago, and I went to spend some time with my partner at the time, who was doing her graduate work at Harvard. And when I was in Cambridge for a few months there, I decided that I would organize a meeting among the Harvard faculty to talk about psychedelics, what we learned from the mistakes of the 60s, and get back into some of the real powerful and important material. And so I knocked on the door of Richard Evans Schultes, who many people know as one of the world's foremost botanists and particularly expert on the role of hallucinogens in culture. And I introduced myself and we hit it off. I said I wanted to do this conference, and he said, well, why don't you invite Gordon Wasson? Now, Wasson to me was like a god, and I was very shy about stuff like that. And I was like, but, and he just pushes his dial phone across the desks and hands me the receiver. And next thing I know, I'm on the phone with this Gordon Wasson guy who Terence McKenna used to refer to as the Moses of the psychedelic movement. So then the next thing I know, I'm in Gordon Wasson's house in Danbury, Connecticut. Borrowed a nice sport jacket from my father. I could show you these pictures. And I'm at Wasson's very modest but beautiful estate in Danbury, a guest of his for lunch, and I drive him up to Cambridge, and we began to discuss all of this stuff. And I was very nervous, and I didn't really know very much, but I felt like I was in a really unique and privileged place. He was a bit of a recluse, and this was really cool for me. And so I honored and admired him. This is 1984. He granted me an interview. He only gave 2 interviews in his whole life. One of them was to me. I think that was just a few months before he died. That's published in my first book, Entheogens and the Future of Religion, where we go into great detail about his career and his books and his feelings about what happened in the 60s. He told me, he hated Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and what, fools they were, and how they tried to exploit his data and all kind of stuff like that. I recommend, people that are listening to this to check out that interview. It's really a good and informative piece. So then years go by. I still am convinced this is really important research to bring out. Wasson dies. I'm connected. I connect with his daughter. The estate, the Wasson estate, gives me the copyrights to his books. I get a small grant from a private foundation to begin a documentary film on him. I gain access to his voluminous archives at Harvard University. They give me an office, a secretary. They bring out whatever I want, trays of data, letters, pictures, all this stuff. And I decide to kind of veer off from his mycological studies. And I saw a file on correspondences, and I said, I'd like that file. They bring me this file, And I'm looking at the people that he's corresponding with, and I'm reading the letters. And just like way back there at Columbia, a light goes off, like, oh my God, this guy who we think is just like a Wall Street banker. He's not just any Wall Street banker. He turns out to be in the inner circle of what I call the American fascist movement. Now, this is another thing that requires a certain background in American history. You know, there are a lot of people that think, oh no, my God, fascism has come to America in the form of Donald Trump. Oh no, this great democracy. You know, we're now in danger of fascism and authoritarian, blah, blah, blah. Well, that is so wrong. The fascism came to America a long time ago. And, you know, you mentioned I'm going to mention a few names here, which I had become familiar with because I'd become a bit of a scholar on the Kennedy assassination, and I knew these names. So I'm looking at this file in Gordon's archives, and like Alan Dulles, he's a close friend, a drinking buddy of Alan Dulles. There are letters between him and Dulles, like, you know, talking about who should be admitted to their club, the Century Club in New York, which is sort of like, you know, a very, very classy, elite place. It's sort of like the East Coast version of the Bohemian Grove. And it is a drinking and social club of the far right aristocratic. And Wasson is a member of this club with Eisenhower and Alan Dulles, and, you know, name somebody. The one name that jumped out to me was George Kennan. Okay, some people pronounce that differently, but George Kennan. A lot of people don't even know who George Kennan was, but George Kennan was one of the most influential so-called diplomats of the post-war period. He was also pro-fascist. George Kennan was giving speeches as an American diplomat in Germany after Pearl Harbor, saying that it's in America's interest if Germany wins the war. Now, this is another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, you know, the Hitler is starting to do his thing over in Europe, and the Americans are just kind of hanging back, not really doing anything about it. And the reason for that is that there were very many, very, very powerful forces in America that were pro-Nazi. You know, I mean, you know, some of them we know. You know, Henry Ford, William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Kennedy, the father of John and of the Kennedys, and but particularly this guy George Kennan, and he and Wasson are best friends. And so suddenly I'm thinking, this is interesting. The guy who introduces the mushrooms is not only a Wall Street banker, so to speak, he's close friends with Alan Dulles, was the head of the CIA. And that's another misunderstanding that people have. There are people, believe it or not, who still think that the Central Intelligence Agency was created in the 1940s to protect us from the dreaded communists. Well, that's not true at all. And another thing that's not true is that the Allies won the war. People think that the Allies, the good guys, won World War II. That's not true either. The Nazis won the war. The war didn't end when Hitler committed suicide in a bunker in Berlin or whatever it was. Hitler didn't die in Berlin. Hitler was secreted out of Europe and died of old age in South America. And don't take my word for it. Do a little Googling yourself and look at the FBI documents that show that, yeah, we found Hitler. He's in Argentina or Paraguay or whatever. And we got to kind of keep this quiet. There's FBI documents you can read for yourself. The war didn't end that way. The war, the Germans, the Third Reich, which were not just Germans, they were British aristocrats and American industrialists. They knew that once America entered the war, they were going to seemingly defeat the Third Reich. So before that happens, large sections of the German intelligentsia, the real brains and power behind the Third Reich, defect over here to America. And they begin to embed them secretly first in an operation called Operation Paperclip, which even the New York Times acknowledges as 5,000, top German scientists and planners come over to America. Well, probably if the New York Times says 5,000, you can bet there were a lot more. And they come over here and they get involved in our aerospace industry. They get involved in our banking. They begin to set up foundations and think tanks like the Manhattan Institute. And this is where we get people like Henry Kissinger and Theodore Shackley and William Casey. And, I hesitate to mention this because I don't want to get into a whole lot of stuff, but George Soros and a lot of very powerful people who were, connected with this Third Reich apparatus are now coming over here. They're teaching at Harvard. They're directing publishing companies. They're infiltrating the media, and they begin another wave of the war. No longer is the war bombing cities and making a big fuss like that. It's an invisible war. It's a war on American consciousness. It's a war to erode, a kind of mentality in America that stood for individualism and independence and was opposed to authoritarianism, fascism, and things like that. And they wanted to just sort of erode that. And so that's a whole thing in itself. But I'm here in Wasson's archives in Cambridge, and I'm going, wow, he and George Kennan are best friends. And I think back to our conversation, years earlier when he said to me, I asked him, because, a lot of hippies would say, geez, if we could just turn on some of the leaders in our government to mushrooms, we could have world peace. Well, it turns out that actually, so I asked Wasson, did he ever do that? Did he ever, try to discuss or turn on his banking colleagues? And could this have been a transformation of American capitalism? And he said, oh no, he said, I never did that. He said, some people in the bank knew that I was doing this, but this was my secret thing. I didn't want to mix the two worlds. That's almost exactly what he said in this interview. And then I look at these letters between Dulles and Wasson and particularly George Kennan and Wasson. And, it was actually George Kennan I have a letter of George Kennan and Wasson, and they're talking about Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. So it's clearly a lie that he doesn't talk about mushrooms with his business colleagues and friends. This was actually a big part of it. It's also became I was thinking, Alan Dulles, not only did he start the CIA, he was one of the main forces behind MK Ultra. He was the main force behind the assassination of John Kennedy, as anybody that's done even a little bit of research into this will know. And these are his pals. These are his social connections. And so that kind of went off in my mind. And then a few years later, this kind of ornery fellow we've talked about a little bit, Jan Irvin, contacts me. And he's impressed with my first book, and he wanted to develop a relationship. And he's very angry, and I kind of put him off. And then finally he sends me a book that he wrote, which is very good. And so I start to develop a rapport with him. And then he goes on and on about Wasson being CIA. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean? Because just to back up a little bit, one thing about this Wasson's expedition to Mexico when he found Maria Sabina, it has been widely reported that the CIA approached Wasson. They were beginning their MK Ultra project. They wanted to investigate hallucinogens for MK Ultra. And at the time, people understood MK Ultra as just an operation to use on enemy agents, or to prepare ourselves for how our enemies, the communist Russians, were going to use psychedelics against us. So we needed to be prepared for them. And Wasson said that the CIA approached him. They wanted to go with him down to Mexico. They wanted to know all the details. And he said to me, he said, give me a day to think about it. And then I called him up the next day and I refused. I didn't want to lose control of my studies. And then the official story is that the CIA secretly infiltrates his project. They send an agent, a secret agent named James Moore, who's a chemist at the University of Delaware. And he says, I have a foundation that funds my research called the Geschechter Foundation. And if you take me along on the trip, I will pay for the whole thing. And so Wasson says, okay, sure, come along on the trip. So Moore comes along on the trip, and then Wasson says he finds out many years later that James Moore was actually an agent of the CIA. Now, I found that unbelievable after learning about Wasson's personal relationship with Allen Dulles, that they would send a secret agent to this. Anyway, so years later, Jan Irvin contacts me. He said, no, Wasson was much more involved with CIA than anybody's realized. I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, look, and he sends me a document. And this is a document which details the funding apparatus for the trip to Mexico. The Mexican expedition of Wasson's was MK Ultra subproject number 58.
Yep.
They pay for the trip, they pay for the recording equipment, they pay for the publication of it. This groundbreaking article of 1957, Seeking the Magic Mushroom in Life magazine, that introduces mushrooms to American consciousness, was a CIA operation from the get-go. Now, that's interesting. That, when you really kind of begin to think about that, is mind-blowing. First of all, the CIA is chartered only as an international operation. They're forbidden to operate domestically. How does funding a sensational article which starts the psychedelic movement, how does that fit in with their charter? You know, so that's one thing. And the fact that he lied to me was kind of personally annoying. And it kind of gave me a little incentive to begin to look into this more and to realize that the official story had a lot of gaps.
All right, so I'm going to jump in here because lots of things you've said that I kind of want to just make some notes and draw some lines to put a pin in for future stuff. And then Dani, I'll see if you have some questions, and then I want to peel back the layer that I looked at before we started today. So I just want to clean up something that I said real fast about Kalindi EE. What Kalindi said was in relationship, he and Sonia were having a conversation about what cryptocurrencies were. And so he was explaining that cryptocurrencies were like a psychedelic currency. So in a sense, he was like sort of like making a comparison between cryptocurrencies and psychedelic mushrooms that I think is valid in terms of the ability to sort of like carry information across realms, right? So like I kind of twisted in some of my perception of what he said. So when we discuss Kalindi EE, which maybe we will do sometime, I'll be sure to clip that segment of the interview so people can hear and they can hear what he said, and then I can kind of pull off my perception of it and get yours based on our understanding of some of these things. So I just wanted to clean that up real fast. The next thing that I wanted to say was when you start talking about that the Nazis really won the war, right? Like that it's a myth that the Allies won the war. Are you familiar with this television show called The Man in the High Castle that is based on the Philip K. Dick book of the same name?
I've watched a few episodes, yeah.
Okay. Do you know Philip? You know everybody. So do you know Philip?
No, never met Philip, and I've never read any of his books.
Okay, me either. I've never read any of his books. I've seen some of the movies that they say are based on his stuff and whatnot. But another person I do a podcast with pushed me to watch this Man in the High Castle. And yeah. I recommend that you watch it from start to finish every episode, and you will see that it's pulling together a lot of what we're talking about here. But basically the premise of that television show, which is available on Amazon Prime, is that the Allies lost the war, and that the United States was taken over basically by a combination of the Japanese and the Asian Pacific states, and then the Reich on the East Coast of the United States, and then there remained a neutral zone in the middle, which wasn't really very neutral, but the whole place still had like this sort of fascist tone to it that you're kind of talking about, right? So that's basically the premise. I don't want to give the series away, right? But it does go into, like, it really gets into us having a complete misunderstanding of everything about our reality. And you did bring up several people that Gordon Wasson was friends with or associated with, including William Casey, who is famous for having said that we will know that our operation is complete when everything that the American people believe is a lie.
Right. I didn't say that Wasson knew Casey. I'm not sure if he did or not, but that's one of the group. Okay.
Okay, but he's part of that group, right? And so I thought that was kind of interesting. And when you watch this Man in the High Castle, you begin to understand some things about, like, the Nazis that we didn't understand before, right? Like, we think of Nazis as like, okay, we just think of like the Hitler, the military stuff, right? The killing of the Jews. And like maybe Hitler had some weird personal obsession with like space, like UFO kinds of things, like other kinds of propulsion systems and stuff like that, right? And that he employed maybe some female psychics that told him about other worlds. Like, we hear these stories, right? But there's not a lot of talk about their interest in psychedelics. There's not a lot of talk about, you know, how sort of obsessive the search into technology that traveled across time and dimensions was, right? Like, we think of Hitler, we think of the whole thing with the Jews and the ovens and all that kind of stuff, right? But it really was largely, the Nazis were very, very interested in controlling time in both directions, right? And the way that that's translated into what we perceive today is as a space program, which would be something that is like out there. We know about Werner von Braun and how he, you know, was brought into NASA and all this kind of stuff. But a lot of what was really going on with these things was underground, was a technology underground, right, that they were experimenting with. And it's part of this story. And so you're at a space, like William Casey says, where everything that the Americans believe is to be, when it falls, then our mission is accomplished, right? So I think a lot of our attention has been directed at space when it should have been directed underground. And mushrooms grow underground. And I'm like, of this, also in this show, they do show that the German youth were using psychedelics and whatnot, which is not something we hear too much about when we hear talk of Nazis and all of that kind of stuff. But I'm curious as to if there was a vast system of worlds or technologies underground, right? Just like we get like other things that are residue with information compressed in them in the other ground. Like, if mushrooms, being something that grows underground, would have sort of compressed information from such places or such technologies. And I just want to introduce that into the conversation here when we're talking about like why the mushroom might be related to some of this kind of thing. And it doesn't make sense yet, but I'm just thinking this as you're talking. You're also talking about whether like the mixing of worlds, you know, like the mixed worlds, like the banking and some of this like religious, cultural stuff, and then these mushrooms and the psychedelic and whatnot. And this pops up over and over with him. And I can trace it even back to like, I'm sure you might be able to do this if you looked into your stuff, Dani, as well. But like, okay, so I'm in my family, like I'm into this like weird stuff, all this esoteric information, psychedelic experiences, bizarre stuff. And the other part, my sister and my father, they're into like African history. And my dad went to the University of London, and my sister's a Black Studies teacher. But you can find all of that stuff in Gordon Wasson. When I started peeling back and doing research and stuff like that, all these people he was part of, like their stuff with University of London, he went over and was part of some like free community in Africa and whatever. So like my dad and sister have no interest in the things that I'm interested in, me very little in what they are. But why is the person who seems to be controlling both realms interested in all of them?
Yeah.
Right? You know, different people fall into sort of different programs that are all sort of being generated by this same central place. And we end up in this weird situation where, like, last week I'm explaining to my father, because he hasn't left his house in 9 months, that he sends me these things that the iCloud makes of his pictures, where it it captures certain periods of time. Right? And he had this trip where he was back east, and there's all these pictures of my nephew, but then they went to some old cathedrals, right? And the cathedrals have like the great psychedelic looking windows up top, right? And I jokingly said to him, if he's ever going to see something like that again in his life, he's going to have to eat mushrooms. And he became very interested when I explained to him that I've never seen that cathedral, but I've never been to that cathedral before, but I've seen that design that's on the top of the cathedral when I eat mushrooms. So then suddenly, for the first time, my dad has a level of interest in mushrooms, right, that I'm talking about, now that he's never leaving his house. So like there is this weird shit going on, right, where like there's been this separation, so that like nobody who's part of one group or the other is aware of like this entire cultural creation that's been going on. Like my dad thinks the shit that he thinks is important is real, things that I think are important are ridiculous, right? But there's a connection to all of the same thing. And it seems to me that like that's what, like, there's no person who that's more perfectly like presented in than Gordon Wasson, who seems to have his hand, you know, in all this banking, cultural stuff, psychedelic movement, mushrooms, religion, this, that, blah, 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 right? And it all kind of comes together in this. And then the other thing that you said was about how, like, oh, if all the world leaders or all the politicians in DC to eat mushrooms, then we would have world peace and they'd see the flaws of capitalism. I find it very interesting. I don't know if you noticed this, but during the whole craze of the election, psychedelic mushrooms were legalized for recreational use in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
Well, I did. Yeah. No, and not only Washington, but there's been of course, you know, this is where I dial into this stuff, but all over the place.
All over the place. Yeah.
Just when I glanced at the media just before we started talking, there were a couple of episodes on, you know, how great psilocybin is for psychotherapy. CNN is doing a thing on it again, and the major media is really hyping psychedelic drugs. And this is, you know, I wanted to say this earlier, but Dani, do you have something before I say this? Do you have any questions?
I can hold my reflections.
Okay. So, you know, one of the other things that occurs to me often as I speak more is that I love psychedelic mushrooms, and I find LSD to have been very, very valuable for me personally and for other people who I've administered it to over the last 30 or so years, 40 years now. Wow. Ayahuasca is tremendously fascinating with great healing virtues. The whole subject is really deeply interesting to me. And so when I'm now expressing this aspect of the subject, it doesn't abnegate the positive aspects of it. It's just very difficult. We really need to look at it, step back from our personal feelings and look at the whole thing. And then I wanted to mention this, something else that I found in the Wasson archives that I thought very significant was, in my interview with him, he says that the first inkling he got of a psychedelic mushroom that was taken and had divine properties was a document that was sent to him by Richard Schultes. And I found that document in his archives. And it's really interesting. It's a thing from the pharmaceutical company Ciba. And it talks about, it's kind of an anthropological report about hallucinogenic mushrooms, and I think it's Siberia, not the psilocybin version of mushrooms, but the Amanita muscaria version. Yeah. But this first paragraph was extremely interesting to me because it says that these the Koryak, some people, some society up there in Siberia, they have this mushroom that they use, and for the most part, this mushroom causes debauchery and confusion among most people. But for a very small number of people, it's used for healing, to bring enlightenment. And I can just imagine Wasson, if he got this document in the 40s. Right there in the first paragraph, there is this dual nature of the mushroom. That the mushroom can be healing, and it can be confusing to most people, but healing for some. And so I just want to put that out there because we're seeing now this widespread advertising of psychedelics and to everybody. But most people are confused by them. You know, for every, you know, Carey Mullis is a guy that's been in the news a lot lately, right? Carey Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for his research that led to the development of the PCR and genetic testing and all that. Now, I quote Carey Mullis in the very first paragraph of my first book, because he said, I think I would have considered myself stupid if it were not for my psychedelic experiences. I mean, it's absolutely true that psychedelic mushrooms or LSD or ayahuasca or all these things can open doors into profound mysteries and give rise to many very important scientific breakthroughs and discoveries. But for every Carey Mullis, you know, there are 1,000 or 2,000 people, you know, that get lost in these realms. And this is why I align myself with my teacher and friend Houston Smith, who advocated that they be regarded with kind of an aura of secrecy, that to know who you're speaking to, if and when, because you know, almost anything can happen, but usually what happens is a kind of confusion. And so I wanted to say that. And
I agree with that, and I think you know, psychedelics and any sort of medicine takes an extreme amount of self-responsibility that, I mean, if this year is any indication, the vast majority of our species is not really operating there. So I have extreme misgivings about all this legalization. But before we get too far away, Robert, I have two questions. So the first one is, in engaging Wasson as you did he seem like someone who was operating with an expansive, elevated consciousness?
It's a really good question, and I've thought about that a lot. My first sense of him was that he was very shy and a bit of an introvert, and he was sort of like he really wanted to connect, but he was withholding at the same time. I didn't really get a sense of a real mystic. I got a sense of a very, you know, kind of paternal scholar. I asked him a few questions. Before I went to interview him, I called Terrence and Dennis McKenna, who were friends of mine, to say, hey, I'm going to go see Wasson tomorrow. What do you think of that? And they were like, holy fuck, are you kidding? And so I threw a few McKenna-ish questions at Wasson, and he just skipped them. He said, I don't deal with stuff like that. That's just not my thing. So he was kind of kept his cards close to his chest. I did have the feeling, you know, when I think about it, and I've looked at, there were a bunch of photographs of he and I together, and I was remembering that time. And I don't know, I just felt, again, this kind of grandfatherly vibe that he wanted to connect because he saw me as someone that might advance his legacy. You know, I was coming there, if I was I called him from Harvard. I was a University of Chicago student. You know, this was the kind of class of people he liked to be with. I drove there in the Lincoln Continental. You know, I wasn't a hippie. I did everything I could to hide the fact that I was. Mm-hmm. And so that I love the question, and I hope I've answered it somewhat.
Yeah, you did. Thanks. And then my other one, which both you and Emily touched on, and Robert, I know you said you had done a lot of research on the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about the Nazis, and Emily, you mentioned NASA, and could we just get a kindergarten version of what NASA actually is?
Well, I mean, as far as I know and what I think is that NASA was, you know, pretty much started by Wernher von Braun, who was the top rocket scientist of Hitler in the Third Reich, and he designed the weaponry that bombed Europe. And before the war ended, von Braun was secreted over here to make our rockets and missiles and to start NASA. and the whole moon project, which I have, now this is, I'm not an astronomer or an astrophysicist or anything. I'm way out of my league here. But I have very serious doubts about the veracity of the official story of the moon landing. So my personal sense, fairly uneducated about it, is that NASA was a hoax to become a distraction from the Vietnam War and to be another kind of feather in this cap of American exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. And I'm puzzled about it because I have a certain respect for John Kennedy, who, you know, that's a whole nother interesting chapter we'll get into here, but that's what I think, that NASA was a Third Reichian distraction for what was going on. Mm-hmm. I just can't believe they really fooled JFK to the extent that they did.
So you want my opinion on what NASA is, Dani?
Yep.
So I think NASA was created like literally to deflect us paying attention to the ground beneath our feet and to the sky above our head, right? So everything like that they say that, like, okay, so we have a big budget for NASA and they're working on this and they're working on that. Like that money is all going into controlling our minds into believing that that is true. Like I think so, like you've heard me talk about how like I equate the secret space program to the brain mapping program and stuff like that, right? So I think that like the answers, all the answers that they say that we need to explore space to know, right? It's a complete inversion, right? Like we need to understand the ground that is beneath us. Like the information that like that tells us who we are is literally in the ground beneath our feet. Mm-hmm. And NASA was there to get us to look up and out, as opposed to look down and in. And I mean that down and in, both into the earth and down and into ourselves, right? So it was basically an externalization of the hierarchy, right? Like that, this agency was created to fund the psychological operation on the people, to be worried about something that is outside of themselves and far away, instead of something that is right underneath their feet and inside of themselves, right? Yeah, so on the more esoteric level, there for that. And as far as the like what do you think about, Robert, the idea that the mushrooms are really a technology, and that what some of these people have done is that like they gained control over, like they discussed, it's not a technology that they invented, it's a technology that they discovered, right? Okay, and that they basically weaponized the fact that they got an understanding of it first, right? And so then they used it for all of these other things. Like maybe this is some sort of natural or organic biological technology in the way that like it stores all of this like information, and you can put like there's so many things embedded in the mushroom experience. Just like if you go on the internet or go on social media, like there's just endless worlds that you can start to go into. Like it's a fucking hallway of information where every room opens another door to another world that has a window that opens another one and another one. And they just got there first and weaponized it, you know what I mean? And sort of pushed it in a certain way. And then at a certain point, like when like a certain amount of control had been gained based on using this technology the same way that they have with the internet, then they want to shut it down, or then they want to flip it, right? They want to flip it from something that has been like used to directly target certain aspects of the population to something that's available to everybody, and then receive that information in the other way, right? Like once it's like everybody knows about it now, so we can't secretly use it. So let's just put it out there and use it to suck everything up so we can siphon out, you know, whatever it is. I think that mushrooms are actually an intelligence network of themselves. And you can see everything when you're there. It's like having access into all of the secret files. They're all there, but there's like tons and tons and tons of them. So you will get information based on the one that you happen to pick up and look at and go through and whatever. But it's like an open network that everything is there. And once a person joins that network based on having the experience, then they become part of that open network, and there is an access point into their minds available, not only for themselves, but for everybody else who's part of the network. It is kind of like, we've always compared it to the internet, but like, it really is that. It really is that. And at a certain point, now they want to see into everybody's minds, right? And the cost for seeing into everybody's minds is that everybody can then also see into theirs or all the other information there, but the people don't know that, right? The people think that it's one thing, and the people who are controlling access to these mushroom experiences, they're weeks and weeks or months and months or years and years ahead of our understanding of what that is. Just like we didn't understand when we signed up for Facebook what it was, but the people who made it available to us always understood that that was where it was going. Now, I'm sure some of the feedback we've provided them through our using of that technology led them into spaces that they never imagined it would, but they always understood that it was for them and not for us. And similar thing with the mushroom.
Yeah, well, what I want to say is that I find that really, truly fascinating and so rich. I mean, that's a whole conversation in itself. And it kind of motivates me to say, to point out a problem with what we're doing here, like just having a podcast, like just that paragraph that you just said, like we could sit down with a group of 10 people and really just take that apart and unpack, everything that you said and really look at it. So, I don't have any answers really, maybe a few.
Well, I propose that we do that at some point.
I would love to do that. One piece that I got from what you were saying, Emily, is that I have serious doubts that the psychedelic mushrooms that are now being approved by the Matrix and the powers that were are going to necessarily allow people the access that we're used to with the wild variety, and how much they're going to be like directed and programmed through their versions.
So I think that, okay, so I have a couple of, I've thought of that too, and I have a couple of versions of how I think this could possibly be. And one is, no, that they're gonna be the same regular old real thing, but they're just so invested in the amount of weaponization they've done as to the, like, that they know that what they are and other people don't. And that the time spent in that confusion before all the people figure out what they already know, right, will allow them enough power and control. So I think that's a possibility.
But it's also it's such a great opportunity for the fucktards to get in, like in a multi-dimensional way that they haven't before. I can't see them letting that pass.
Right, no, so then I think that I don't know if it's like, we obviously when we don't know like where something is coming from, like who grew it, what did they grow it with, where did they grow it, there's that possibility. Then there's also the other possibility that like even the ones that we think of as like organic and real and whatever, that they have weaponized a frequency technology that can tap into the experience and basically like set up a checkpoint, right? Where like you hit a wall and you either.
Have you had that experience?
I haven't had that experience, but I can see. So like one of the things that came to me on a psychedelic experience was that that this had either the potential for, or that in fact this software called Promise software was based on the psychedelic experience. And it's basically like having a portal into software that kind of opens portals and technologies to follow your assets, right? And so like I think that like like one has to ask the questions like, well, how could the CIA have infiltrated the mushroom, right? Like it's not like, or like raided the mushroom. Like when somebody, like when a drug network gets busted, it's generally the SWAT team or that narcotics agencies or whatever have infiltrated a crack house and set up cameras or whatever, right? Like, are there cameras in the mushroom, right? Like how would this happen with something nature? But what we don't always understand is like when you are on mushrooms, something changes in your vibration and your frequency, right? That is probably detectable. And so there could be things frequency wise, because we lived in this total frequency soup now, that are aimed at that, right? Like that kind of when a person reaches a certain level, then suddenly there's this thing. right? So I don't know. And I don't know, like, and I don't know that like they can control that space in the way that they would like to if they're trying to set something like that up, but that's not going to stop them from trying, which can create all sorts of both confusing and enlightening experiences for people. So I think, but I think more than anything, and I'm getting to this place with everything, whether it's like the politics, the censorship, the technology, the food, all of this kind of stuff, is that one of their biggest like tools that they like to use is leading us to believe that they have control over something, and they might know a little bit more about something than we know, but they would like us to believe that they're actually generating the whole thing, right? And the information that they it's basically like guarding people from getting to the level of awareness that they have until they get to the next level. So they're always just ahead of us in their knowledge, and they can use that to control us, rather than that they're so brilliant that they have generated all these systems of control. It's really just like creating checkpoints that someone has to stop at while the crook gets away farther away while they're stopped at the checkpoint, kind of thing, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And again, I think it's just really, really fertile material to sit down and look at and use our critical intelligence and see what kind of sense we can make of it. For my part, I have scheduled a deep dive for pretty soon, later this week. I have a birthday coming up, so I thought I would die and be reborn. And I'm going to take my first really strong dose of mushrooms since quite a few decades ago, a while ago, when I had this trip and I was getting a lot of this material, and it was just really overwhelming my little brain. And I wanted to know who was this on the end of the line, hearing voices telling me about the state of the world, the future of society, all kinds of stuff. I said, "Who are you?" And they said, I don't know if you've ever heard these voices on the mushroom, but they can be sort of jocular and a little punitive. And they were sort of slapping me around a little bit. And they said, "Well, what do you mean? Who are we? You came to see us. You took the mushrooms."
Yes.
I said, "Okay, well then show yourselves. I'd like to see you. Who can I see you?" And they said, this is what they said. This has been bouncing around my head since like the mid 80s when it happened. They said, "We're not going to show ourselves to you. We want you to remain a human being for a little while longer." And what does that mean? What does that mean? And so I just took it like, okay, I'm biting off a little more, and I'm going like, this is enough for now. I would take small doses and socially and my own little meditation, but I haven't done one of these big 5 gram things in quite a while. But I'm unless I chicken out, which is possible, I'm going to do it in a couple of days, and I'll tell you what I found or didn't find.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have had periods of time in my life where I've done mushrooms on a regular basis, other periods of times where I haven't done them at all, varying levels of doses. Like I had 2 experiences rather recently. I had one just this past weekend and one about like a month or so prior to that, right? But that was the closest that I've taken them in a long time. And it is interesting, like the various levels and different things I see or, like orienting yourself in that space. And I'm starting to understand, like, those warnings may be against exactly what we're talking about with these people who have figured that space out, and then they start to do things that aren't human, right? Like, I think it takes a vast amount of like just general life experience and also like maturity within yourself to gain that level of awareness and then not use it to fool other people. Right. And maybe at the time when they said that to you, you weren't in that space. I've had the conversations with some of these voices being, I don't know what it is either. Sometimes there's some of that for me, sometimes there's not. But I do see how, in the wrong hands or with the wrong person or with someone who hasn't like done their work or whatnot, like that space can be very, very weaponized by anybody who's familiar with it, right? Yep. And so, and yeah, and so it's just it's rich for so many things, and I think it should be explored. And also, I think there should be caution when exploring. And it's very, there's no answer. There's not an answer as to the solution as to what to do about this.
Yeah, there are intelligent
Before we get
questions.
too far away, oh, sorry, but before we get too far away, Robert, I'm just sitting with what the mushrooms told you,
Mhm.
and that a visual, that a reveal would take away your humanity. So I'm sitting here in my mind thinking like, well, what is it that would visually destroy your humanity? And I feel like it has to be something familiar. It has to be something that you already know that would shake you so hard from your adherence to consensus reality that you would relinquish your humanity. Like, you've had, what, 40 years to ponder this? What were they telling you? What is the thing? What are they?
Yeah, I know. It's a mystery. I don't know. It was, and like Emily's saying, I think that, there's convergent thinking where we come to an answer, and there's divergent thinking where we create more possibilities and go outward. So I'm sort of in the middle here. I'm a scholar and a historian that wants to make sense of something that, many of the traditions say you don't make sense of. I mean, this goes back to the very beginning of the word mysticism and mystery. These are not things that we solve. These are things that we experience. They're not. They're not.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go. It's okay.
Well, do you believe that mushrooms are terrestrial in origin or extraterrestrial?
Well, I think that they are both.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know that, but I think that. I think there's data that shows that mushroom spores travel through space. There certainly has seemed to be an extraterrestrial component to them. They go back so very far in history but they grow in the earth. They grow in the earth. There's the fruiting body. There's not a simple answer to that question except to say both.
So I think, like, I agree with what he said. And also, just like NASA, just like we believe that NASA and all this stuff is about controlling or understanding space, I would reframe it to time. I think mushrooms are time travel kinds of technology rather than necessarily space travel, right? Not that the two things aren't related and connected in any ways, but I think so many things that we understand as having to do with space or outer space or space travel is really more about time and dimension and geometry and things like this, a given space. And we're really more exploring the various angles and realities that can fold in on themselves and whatnot. It's not this vast never ending thing. It's this finite thing that can be rearranged in an infinite number of ways kind of thing. Yeah. So I think that, and I think a lot of that is sort of just compressed and folded into them and can be sort of revealed in various ways depending on the nature of the person and their level of awareness, consciousness, what's going on in their body, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, right? So I want to just wrap this back around to Gordon Wasson, before we end. And I want to share with you guys some of the things I looked at as I just decided to do a one-layer peel, because you could spend the rest of your life doing this, right? So I'm going to screen share with you guys. Hold on just a second. Let me pull this back up. Sorry, I restarted my computer before we started here because at the end of the last recording I did, there was, okay, hold on a second. I'm having an issue with here we go. Okay, so the first thing I did was I did a search just for Gordon Wasson, right? And and I also remembered that, and I think we should both, yes, Jan Irvin is a difficult character, and also he's done some of the best research on all of this stuff, so we hold both things in our mind. But I went to his web brain of the search for Gordon Wasson, and when you see Gordon Wasson, these are all of the people, projects, and programs that Jan and Richard Grove, I think, worked on this project together, were able to connect him to. Okay, so you see this is all these little blue lines, all these lines that I'm lighting up right now, they all connect Gordon Wasson to some sort of project, movement, operation, or person that was, that we might deem suspicious, right? Look at all of it. There's tons of them. So I just clicked on a few of the most interesting ones and even just in the basic summary that is given down here, like it talks about a lot of the things that Robert talked about, right? And mentions some of the same little stories and a few of the same characters. And also like there's this list of like the times that he's referred to by other people who are suspicious and whatever. And then at the bottom, there's some connection to Columbia and whatnot, which I know didn't you go to Columbia, Robert?
That's one of the schools I went to among many, yes.
Yeah, and there's connection here with one of the people he was involved with in University of London. So like even just in the general story about him, this little clip at the bottom here, like it already reaches into the personals for both Robert and I in a variety of other ways. But I opened up a couple of the links, and here like I found, hold on just a second because my computer is just reloading.
Robert, did you see any errors in that? Did that all line up with what you know?
Well, I haven't seen that for a while. I think it's a really brilliant thing. I don't know that Jan did it himself, and there are drawbacks to it, because if you were to do that with me, you would find that I was connected to everybody who was involved, who has suspicious origins, and that doesn't necessarily mean nefarious connection. So that's one thing we got to look through, that kind of thing.
Correct. The whole thing with this, and this is, I'd say, what Jan's biggest shortcoming is he doesn't seem to be able to differentiate between correlation and causation, right? Yeah. Like just because
Jan has accused me of being the mastermind of MKUltra in the world, kind of thing, just because of my connections. And and it may actually be true that I was secretly recruited to be part of a social engineering scam because of my, fairly significant role in instigating this modern renaissance. Like this paper here that you're bringing up, I know that paper. And Wendy Doniger was also my professor at the University of Chicago, where I did my master's degree. Right. And I think that's really super interesting about the Summer Institute of Linguistics, I think it's called, that was funded some of her research. And then if we, for people that are interested in going down some of these rabbit holes, there's a connection between the Summer Institute of Linguistics and Terence McKenna, who was a close friend and a guy I really enjoyed, even if I'm critical of him these days. So yeah, that's an interesting document there, The Religious Crusades of the CIA. Okay, so
so I just pulled up a few just to show like the variety of things that have been connected to him, right? So I caution people, like this is like Dani, like you and I were once libtards, right? So like by basically saying that like, because like this is sometimes what Jan does is he'll say, well, so-and-so knew Gordon Wasson, therefore they're a CIA agent. Basically, that's what his implication, right? So it would be like, because it's like when people, like, because you and I are both by birth Jewish, then we therefore are part of the Zionist conspiracy. Or because you and I were once of the left, we cannot be trusted because we once voted for a Democrat or whatever. It's not logical because, you can't know something until you know. So I couldn't know that, like, I didn't even, like, I was born Jewish before I knew about the Zionist conspiracy, or whatever. So that kind of thing. So yes, I agree with you, but the web brain is really cool, and you can basically do your own research through it and find out and come to your own conclusion about whether you think each character who comes up in these things is the cause of the problem, or is involved in the problem, or just happens to be there and got caught up in it, or what, the answer is going to be different for everyone. So anyway, we find papers like this, right? The religious crusades of the CIA. Well, what was the CIA doing religious crusades? And why does Gordon Wasson, who also was part of the psychedelic crusade, come up in the paper about the religious crusades, right? Like you find this linguistic stuff. It's like, why, how do these things all connect?
Well, that gets to your notion of currency earlier. There's psychedelic or intellectual currency, and it's, shifting currents. And
Yeah. So then I found like this here, right? And so like here's letters from like this is obvious. He's writing letters to like their friends to Dulles on JP Morgan paper, right? So no one can just say, oh well, they happen to just be in the room together at one time. He's wishing him a happy holiday, right? On JP Morgan paper, right? So it's like, okay.
Yeah. I might have given him that. We've exchanged quite a few documents, Jan and I, before our relationship broke down.
Right. So he's going through like the various kinds of things. Like there's hundreds of these. I just picked a few that like popped out at me for some reason. So this is, social networks, influencers, and the story of LSD. So this goes to my comparison, right, about like social media and all that kind of stuff. There's this little article like about some of this stuff and brainwashing and psychedelics and the connections between these people and who are the influencers of then, and that works the same with technology now. Right. So it's kind of interesting. I'll include links to all of these in the show notes so people can click on this themselves as well as to the web brain. Right. But they had evangelists for the mushrooms, like you have evangelists for the religion. Right. So it's kind of interesting. And then there's this one, right, that I thought was interesting. Like this is like a government memorandum kind of thing. Like these were people who they were looking to fill a position, and these were the people who were being considered because they fit the criteria and they also yet weren't widely thought of as being agents. So they could be a good agent because nobody would know they're agents.
Emily, just a second. My eyes aren't good enough to really read that, but is that the one about the psychological strategy board?
I don't see those terms, but this one says the initial. So basically it's the PSBF. That's strategy board. Yes.
Yes. Would you, I'm particularly interested in that document. I've been looking for that one. I don't want to call Jan. I don't speak with him anymore.
I'll send it to you. Yeah.
But I'd like to see that document. That's the one where it says someone not obviously connected with CIA.
Yes.
I see that in the study that list of people.
Yeah. So and he was considered a person who still had enough normal cred to do this job and not be an obvious plant. Right. Yeah. Okay, so then this is just like I'll include this. This is just his Wikipedia entry, right? And even though we think Wikipedia is dumb and controlled, and it is, just going through this, you're like, what the fuck? How can this person have done and been at all these places and had all these positions and done all this stuff? It's like Shakespeare. Like they say like that Shakespeare is like a conglomerate of a lot of different people that no one could have like done and said all the things. Like it's like that, right? Like there's all of this. You could just use this as a jumping off point and get to like a zillion different things. And then this one was, let's see which one this one is real fast. All right, sorry, I cleared my computer so we wouldn't have any problems because I was having problems with the previous recording. All right, so here's the article from Life magazine, right? This was the actual, sorry, this is High Times. It was about, this was High Times. Yeah, and they talked a lot about the article in Life and Time in this. And when I was reading this, like I think I just read like 2 or 3 of the paragraphs, and already you're finding like, why is the same person interested in all of these various things? Like you said, Dani, religion, journalism, mushrooms, banker, right? Like just when you read one paragraph about him, we're like, who is this? James Bond, right? Like, what is this? Okay, and then here is an interesting little thing that is like, leading psychiatrist blows the whistle on his own profession by I don't know if you know who Walter Board is, but in my opinion, he wrote one of the best books on mind control. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to see that one too. Walter, damn, I had several chances to connect with Walter before he died.
I think Walter was the first person to really fucking get what was going on. He, Philip K. Dick, like these were the guys who I think got an understanding of what was happening while it was happening, and everyone thought they were crazy because they were able to see into the future with it. But there's also some quotes in here, interestingly, from Colin Ross, right, who basically is an interesting character in all of this because he both blows the whistle on certain aspects of psychiatry and MK Ultra, but also like there's some issues about him for some people that I can't quite clarify. But all the people that are named in this are super interesting, including Gordon Wasson. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. Walter Boert is very fascinating.
Walter is a very fascinating guy. We spoke on the phone just once. I, for many years, had been friends with his former wife, Peggy Mellon Hitchcock, who was is still alive, and I reconnected with her about a year or so ago, and they were married, and she's a member of the Mellon family, and she was a big supporter of Leary. And then there's a Mellon CIA stuff. It gets a little too, it's very challenging stuff.
I mean, and some of the most interesting stuff that Walter ever talked about was some kind of LSD he was given that lasted 30 days, and that caused him to bilocate. People were seeing him at various locations, you know, multiple locations at the same time, right? Which goes to like some of the dimensional and time travel aspects of some of these technologies that I think that, you know, need more digging into, right?
He wrote a very important paper that's not circulated enough, but I think it's really relevant now as we look at the state of America. Back to my earlier statement about who won the war. It's a paper Walter Bard is a co-author of. It's called something like The Invisible Third World War.
Yep, I'm familiar with the paper. Yes.
It's co-authored by a pseudonym, a guy who's a very close friend of mine, but who thinks he would do it differently now. But anyway, I think it's important stuff.
So then
Walter's family, I connected with his daughter not that long ago to see if I could get his archives, and the brother has them, and they didn't really want to get into it, and they basically, she was saying that they thought her father was crazy, but you know, I don't know.
So
certainly an eccentric, courageous man. And you know, there's so many levels of this. And there's so much subterfuge and disinformation. It's really like you said, you can spend a lot of time on it, and it's important, but it's challenging inquiry.
So then this part was interesting to me. This is a paper. This is from the Council on Foreign Relations, right? And Gordon Wasson is being taught, right? Like they're basically setting up a meeting as part of a program to bring the community to Africa, right? And so this takes, I just found this one interesting for me, and I'm just using it as an example because I think probably other people could find ones that are relevant to them, right? But like, so was kind of obsessed with things that are considered more of the psychedelic realm, or the kind of counterculture that is like your McKenna-esque, Leary-esque, whatever, Walter kind of thing. But the rest of my family is obsessed with Africa, right? And so like, what is this community in Africa, and why is this person who is part of the psychedelic movement presiding over a new movement in Africa? And just like the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, like, you know, brought a certain level of discord on the national stage, like, so like we're experiencing in this country the kind of racial discord that was once, you know, experienced in South Africa, that my sister and my dad have done a lot of studying about. Like, why are these things connected, right? That seems like doesn't make a, like, would you think of like, you know, why would the same person be like connected to both movements? I think that's weird, don't you?
Well, I don't think it's weird. I think it makes sense if we use the Brave New World model. Basically, what I think what they're trying to do. I mean, globalism is a way of, you know, it's a global domination agenda, as my friends Foster and Kimberly in their Thrive project call it, and it's a concentration of wealth. It's a pyramidal concentration of wealth, in which impoverishes most of the world. And as Huxley wrote in his novel, they don't do anything about the rest of the world is kind of unable to do anything about it. They're distracted. And when they get too distracted and too restive, like maybe which we saw in the early 60s, they throw psychedelic drugs at them. It's fairy dust. It distracts them. And they're given a drug that makes them think that everything is mystical and cool and it's all one, and trust and don't worry and don't bother registering voters and don't really pay attention to what's going on now. Like you were saying, go off into the future or go back in the past. It's a distraction technique. Yeah.
And, you know, people who are interested in things like that you and I have all researched, like, makes sense to us, but to the average person, they could never see the connection. But it's really interesting to me, like, while we're experiencing, so like this thing Gordon Wasson was involved in was like involving Ivory Coast and France. Well, like, you know, there's all this connection between like South Africa and England. And that's the kind of program my dad was sort of like involved in on a certain level. But at the same time that we're experiencing all of this sort of, revival of racism and whatever in the United States, we're also getting all the drugs legalized, right? So these things have been going hand in hand, right, since back then. And, and it is the same characters pulling all of those, sort of strings. And I think he's the archetype.
Let me just slip this in here now, because a really important book, I probably mentioned this last time, that I recommend to everyone interested in this, is a book by a fellow named John Potash. I don't know if you pronounce that.
I love John Potash.
Yeah. Okay. So
drugs as war.
Drugs as weapons against us, which gets into some of the history of this. It's kind of the oldest trick in the book. And he was new to me, like to look at the origin of, we all know about Skull and Bones. Okay, so look at the money that was behind the original Skull and Bone. Yale University actually is opium smuggling monies. So, then the Skull and Bones crowd is, to some extent, where a lot of the CIA activity originated. A really decent movie on this is called The Good Shepherd. Yeah. If you haven't seen that yet, that's worth a see. And then Skull and Bones, I forgot to say this before, that's Henry Luce, who is the creator and editor and publisher of the whole Time Life thing that Wasson, that kicked off this whole psychedelic movement. It's also where,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The concept of American exceptionalism, the kind of amping up of the concept of American exceptionalism is Henry Luce and the Time Life enterprise.
Do you know John Potash?
No, I never met him personally. We've had some correspondence. I forget why our relationship didn't get off to a good start, but we've healed that stuff, partly because I have all these associations in the modern movement. And I reached out to him after I read his book, like, man, you did such great work. He did I think he errs in, and I think this is why we were a little sideways at first, that I criticized him for failing to recognize that psychedelics also have beneficial properties. And by failing to recognize that, he loses a lot of his audience, that is the audience that he really needs to communicate to. Like, there are a lot of people that love psychedelic drugs, use them with some merit, but are tricked by the phenomena. Those are the people that I want to talk to. That's kind of my audience.
Me too. I think that unfortunately you have the people out there who think like psychedelics are a panacea and the solution to everything. And then you have a group who thinks that psychedelics are dangerous and you shouldn't do them. And the truth is somewhere in between. And there's a very, and I've experienced both aspects of it, right? Like both aspects. And then now I'm kind of in this third space with it where like I know all of the things that I know, and I can still recognize that there are benefits to that there's things that you can understand, that you can learn, that you can know, that you can feel, so it's a very challenging topic because it's super polarizing, right? And some of the people who do the best work on one aspect of it completely don't get the other aspect.
Yeah. And so Drugs as Weapons Against Us is a really important text. Like, if I was going to teach a graduate course or university course on this, that would be required reading. Also, the really important work of an English scholar, Alan Piper, Piper, who has written some really important papers, monographs, more than papers, but not quite books, on this. And one is called Strange Bedfellows, where he goes into some of the pre-war history, far-right involvement with psychedelics. We began to correspond about that, that when we do the Albert Hoffman thing, we'll get into that more, but readers will want to know Alan Piper's work, and he would be a good guy to do a show with. And then another one would be, because Alan also is a real psychedelic aficionado. He's had great experiences. He loves the community, but he also, as a historian, really grounded in method and rigor, wants to tell the whole story. Also gets into some really interesting, creepy stuff about the publisher that's published two of my books, Inner Traditions in Vermont. There's stuff in there. And then also very important to bring up is Joseph Atwill. Joe Atwill, who used to work closely with Jan. They had a podcast for a while. They also had a falling out. But Joe is absolutely top shelf kind of guy who's not afraid to share his very controversial researches into secret societies, into origins of Christianity, and just a really brilliant man, a gentleman and a scholar, a close friend of mine. And, you know, as I'm mentioning these names, I've been wondering, also Jay Fikes, who wrote the very important exposés on the Carlos Castaneda legend, exposing that as an operation, much like the Summer Institute of Linguistics and the CIA, and, you know, trying to create these sort of phony, faux shamanic traditions in the US with the bozo Carlos Castaneda and the non-existent Don Juan that millions of people fell for, you know, that kind of thing. And Joe and I, and also David Price, an important scholar, not the son of Esalen founder, but an anthropologist up in the Northwest somewhere, trained at Duke. His books, The Weaponization of Anthropology, is really important stuff. And I'm just saying this, I'm kind of thinking out loud that maybe one thing I do this year is to organize a conference with these kinds of speakers to sort of counter this dominant narrative about psychedelics and how great they are for you, just to kind of tell the whole story. So maybe I'll do that.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Like all of these things that we're talking about all look different from different perspectives, right? Like, so I'm familiar with some of the Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan kind of stuff, which is largely absurd. But embedded within it that doesn't get so much attention are things that are actually like good data points, right? And so you have, and this goes for all the stuff that you just talked about and that we all talk about, like, right? Like they're embedding a bunch of fiction and things that are supposed to be true, and really important truths and things that are obviously bullshit and fiction, right? And so we're looking at this absolute mess of information spread out all over the place. And I think like we all need to sort of back up and go, whoa, wait a second. And it's really hard to do when we all have like, oh, I like this person's version of like what psychedelics and truth are. And I like this person, and this person is my hero, and this one's a scholar, right? Like there's they have made such a good mess of this that it is so hard to like suss out, you know, and you know, pull out threads and truths and whatnot. But I think we are all really wise to dig into some of these lesser known people, whether we see them as problems or helpful, right? Because there's little nuggets and, you know, like whatever, like our Gordon Wasson could have been the shepherd of the person who shepherded in the biggest round of bullshit we've ever experienced. But within all that bullshit are things that are undeniably true. And it takes like quite a bit of like rigor with your own like mind and check and your own just perspective on things and all the things you pay attention to like arrive at something that is like a reasonable representation of something that might be true. I think that's like maybe the best we can do right now.
I feel like that being the case, it's, you know, worst best time to launch psychedelics on the public in this mass fashion because there's so many controlled people with zero sense of self, with zero sense of discernment, with zero skills, maturity to handle what is now being not just presented to them, but like pushed at them. It feels like it's going to be a disaster of epic proportions.
Well, I think confusion is like the definite tactic of the day, right? Create so much chaos and confusion that nobody knows what is what. And that is a better way to control the people than having anybody understand anything. Right.
It's also possibly, so what you just said, Danny, brings up the subject of Timothy Leary, and I can't wait to do that episode because Tim was really one of my favorite characters in the whole drama, who, as I understand it now, and I really knew him the best for a long time, since 1980 till his death. I knew him, and first thought he was just a fool who blew everything. That's basically with the narrative that Michael Pollan asserts. Then I realized, no. Tim woke up to this operation. He woke up to the fact that he was recruited and was being used, and then he worked against them. So Dani, what you were just saying about chaos, chaos can be destructive, but it can also be fertile.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's what Tim was trying to produce. Tim and Frank Barron both were more Tim behind the popularizing psychedelics. I mean, really advertising. He was selected because he was charming and articulate and handsome and Harvard, and he was a great salesman. And then he was, but he also loved the idea of democracy, and he hated authoritarianism, and he hated central powers, and he wanted to democratize the movement. He knew that there would be a lot of chaos, but he thought that that was going to be necessary to upset the totalitarian agenda, and so that's what he set out to do.
I mean, it's any of these characters, like if you shift the direction that you're looking at them from, look different. So in that sense, they themselves are psychedelic, right? Because yeah.
Well, that's the idea that I had when I decided to do a book about Leary after visiting Hofmann in Switzerland and finding out, he might have sort of been a Nazi, Hoffman. And I wanted to go talk with Tim about that. And then I developed a different point of view about Tim. There are so many different points of view about Tim that I decided to do a book. Like, you can't take a picture of Tim. You have to take a lot of them and create a kind of mosaic character. All the facets, like this crystal I have, all these different facets to it. And I'm looking for it. Yeah, it's an important story that needs to be told.
All right. I think that, Dani, I'm going to give you the last word because Robert and I have done the bulk of the talking today. So I'm going to give you the last word and then I'll wrap it up. Do you have anything else that you kind of wanted to?
Just Godspeed on your journey. Be brave. Show up for the task, Robert. It's going to be, I'm excited to hear all about it and for us to dive in again next time.
Absolutely. And thank you, Robert. And I think maybe next time we'll go for Albert Hofmann. I think that might be the next one, and then whatever one should be next shall be revealed during that session. So I want to thank everyone who joined us to listen to this today. Why don't you let people know where they can find your work, or if you are interested in interaction or contact, where they can do that?
Well, I'm still, my everything burned down a few months ago, so I'm still in the process of reconstituting myself. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that the only public platform is Facebook. So you can find me on there. I'm welcoming people there. I stir up stuff there. And maybe as this rebirth is finished in this month, I'll create my own website there. I'm not sure what I'm doing. There's a lot of possibilities. So Facebook for now is cool. And yeah, let's just leave it there.
All right, cool. That wraps it up for us today. We will see you next time. You can find Dani at danicatz.com. You know where to find me because you found me here. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Wait, Emily, make sure that you please send the series of documents that you flashed up there.
Absolutely. I will send
Yeah, I'd love to look at those.
I'll send the series of documents and I'll include them in the show notes so that people who watch the show can look at them as well. Okay?
Fantastic.
All right.
Okay.